So, here's what happened 45,000 years before Christ. The world changed in a way that still haunts our collective memory, even if we don't realize it. Imagine you're living in what we now call Siberia, and over the course of maybe 30 years, just one generation, the temperature drops 20 degrees. Not a cold snap that lasts a week. Not a bad winter. We're talking about the entire climate system shifting so dramatically that everything your parents and grandparents taught you about survival suddenly becomes dangerously obsolete. The old people spoke of winters you could survive with good preparation, with thick furs and stockpiled food and sturdy hide shelters. But now ice storms were arriving in September, snow was still falling in May, and the storms themselves had become something monstrous, something their ancestors would not have recognized. A woman named Cora lived through one of these new winters. We don't know if that was really her name, of course. The stories that survived are fragments, whispers passed down through so many generations that we're lucky to have anything at all. But we know what happened to her clan because it happened to hundreds of clans across the northern world during this period. One night, in a storm that came on with shocking speed, their hide shelters collapsed under snow so heavy it might as well have been wet concrete. The weight was simply more than the poles and stakes could bear. Half the clan froze to death that night. Just think about that for a moment. You go to sleep surrounded by your family, your friends, everyone you've ever known, and by morning, half of them are gone. The temperature had dropped so low that exposed skin froze in minutes. Adults died trying to dig others out. Strong hunters who could track prey for days simply stopped moving, their bodies shutting down in the lethal cold. Cora's 7-year-old daughter Mira survived, but not because anyone saved her. The child had been thrown clear when the shelter collapsed. Instead of trying to run through the storm, which would have killed her in minutes, she did something that probably came from pure animal instinct. She burrowed into a snowbank, and there, pressed against the earth itself, she discovered something that would change human history. The ground was warm. Not hot. Not even what we'd call comfortable. But compared to the screaming wind and the deadly air above, the earth held heat that the storm could not steal. Mira stayed there, packed in snow and dirt, until the storm passed. When Cora found her daughter alive the next morning, she understood immediately what this meant. Now, we need to talk about why this discovery was made by women and children, not by the hunters and warriors. The men were focused on one thing, the thing that had kept humans alive for hundreds of thousands of years, following the prey. Hunting required ranging far and wide, reading animal signs, thinking about movement and migration. It was vital work. Without it, everyone starved. But this focus meant that male attention was constantly directed outward, across the landscape, following tracks and blood trails. Women's attention moved differently. They were gathering plant food, yes, but they were also watching children, noticing patterns in the environment that affected the group's immediate survival. They saw which hillsides stayed bare of snow even in brutal storms. They noticed that certain small caves seemed to exhale warm air on frigid mornings, creating little clouds of condensation. And they understood, in a way that came from their own bodies, that warmth rising from below was real and reliable. Here's something that might surprise you. Pregnant women had been instinctively seeking out these warm spots when labor began. Before Mira's discovery, before anyone consciously understood what was happening, women in labor were being drawn to places where the Earth's heat was closest to the surface. This wasn't superstition. This was body wisdom accumulated over millennia, the same kind of wisdom that tells migratory birds when to fly south. The connection between feminine body awareness and the Earth's hidden warmth created the first systematic exploration of underground spaces. Cora wasn't content with just finding warm spots. She wanted to understand them, control them, make them reliable. She organized the women into what we might call the first construction teams, though they probably didn't think of it that way. They were just trying to keep their children alive. The organization itself was brilliant. Cora used the women's monthly bleeding cycles to coordinate work periods. She understood that energy levels varied throughout the month, that there were times when women felt stronger and times when they needed rest. So she scheduled the most demanding work for when the most women were at peak energy. This might be the first example in human history of managing a workforce based on biological rhythms, rather than just pushing everyone to work constantly regardless of capacity. They needed tools, of course. You can't dig through frozen earth with your bare hands, at least not for long, so they developed specialized implements, each one designed for a specific purpose. Antler picks were weighted with stones to give them the heft needed to break through hard-packed soil. Shoulder blades from large animals became shovels, their natural curve perfect for scooping out loosened earth. And they created tiny bone awls, about the size of your finger, for detail work around roots and rocks. Every single one of these tools was blessed with red ochre before being used. They painted them with this iron-rich pigment and spoke words asking Mother Earth's permission to enter her body. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was a sophisticated understanding that they were doing something unprecedented, something that required respect and care. They were breaking the oldest, human taboo, deliberately entering spaces that had always been forbidden, dark and dangerous, and full of unknown threats. The first real shelters were probably crude, barely more than enlarged animal burrows, but they worked. Families that had access to even a small underground chamber survived winters that killed everyone else. And that meant shelter construction quickly became the most valuable skill anyone could possess. The first major conflict over shelter happened at a place the stories call Wolf River. A clan that historians name the River Clan had found a natural cave system and spent years carefully expanding it, learning its passages, making it safe and habitable. Then raiders came. 70 warriors from the grasslands, men who had never learned the digging arts, tried to take by force what they had not built. 32 people defended that cave. Most were women, some were elderly. They were outnumbered more than 2 to 1. But they knew every passage, every turn, every ledge and gap. The attackers had to come through narrow entrances where numbers meant nothing. The defenders rolled boulders from hidden positions. They threw burning animal fat into confined spaces where the smoke became a weapon. They struck from darkness and vanished before the raiders could respond. The siege lasted 3 days. When it ended, 20 attackers lay dead, and the rest had retreated. The River Clan had won, but more importantly, they had established a principle that would echo through human history. Those who improved the earth owned its protection. If you built the shelter, if you knew its secrets, if you had invested your labor and ingenuity into making it safe, then it was yours to defend. By 40,000 years before Christ, every clan of any size had designated shelter builders. These weren't just workers. They were specialists, craftspeople who possessed knowledge that meant the difference between life and death. And critically, they taught their skills to children through songs. These digging songs encoded everything a builder needed to know: the dimensions of a safe chamber, the spacing required for support beams, the warning signs that meant collapse was imminent. The songs were memorable, rhythmic, designed to stick in the mind. A girl would learn them from her mother and grandmother, singing while she worked, and 30 years later she would teach them to her own daughters with barely a word changed. Those songs, or at least fragments of them, survived for 1,000 generations. Elements of them can still be found in working songs recorded in the 19th century, in folk music from Siberia to Scotland. The knowledge they carried kept people alive across an ice age, and the fact that they worked so well meant they were preserved with almost religious exactness. Winter had become death, but humanity had learned to hide from it in the body of the earth itself. What started as one child's desperate instinct became a civilization-saving technology, and it all began with women noticing what no one had paid attention to before, with mothers determined to keep their children alive no matter what the world threw at them. Between 40,000 and 35,000 years before Christ, something remarkable happened. Shelter construction stopped being desperate, scraping at frozen ground, and became something we can only call engineering. Real engineering, with principles and measurements and techniques that would be recognized by any architect today. And at the center of this transformation were women who commanded the kind of respect and authority that most people assume didn't exist until civilizations built cities. We call them the Builder Queens, though that's our translation, our way of understanding what they were. These were women who commanded workforces of 200 people or more. They designed multi-level complexes that seem absolutely impossible when you consider they had no metal, tools. Everything was done with stone, bone, antler, and wood. And yet they created structures that housed hundreds of people through winters that lasted 9 months. The most legendary of these builder queens was a woman named Sura, of the Bone Carver tribe. Now, Sura made a discovery that changed everything about how quickly and efficiently people could excavate. She figured out that if you heated granite with fire until it was almost too hot to approach, then suddenly doused it with ice water, the thermal shock would make it split cleanly. What had taken a month of careful chipping and pecking could now be done in 3 days. Think about what this meant. Suddenly, shelter construction wasn't limited by how much rock you could slowly chip away. You could work with the stone itself, make it cooperate through understanding its properties. This wasn't luck or accident. This was experimentation, hypothesis testing, the scientific method before anyone had a name for it. Suras. The greatest creation was something the stories call the Hall of Seven Fires. This structure housed 300 people. Let me repeat that, because it's easy to just gloss over the number. 300 human beings lived in a space this woman designed and her teams built, underground with Stone Age tools. The hall had 7 fire pits, but these weren't randomly placed. Each one was positioned with mathematical precision to create air currents that pulled smoke through hidden ventilation shafts while distributing heat evenly through the sleeping chambers. The ventilation alone would have required an understanding of airflow that most modern people don't possess. Hot air rises, cold air falls, but in a complex underground structure with multiple levels and chambers, managing those flows so that you get heat without smoke, fresh air without deadly drafts, requires real genius. And they did it. 300 people breathing, 7 fires burning constantly, and the air stayed breathable through 9-month winters. But here's the thing about engineering. You learn as much from failure as from success, maybe more, and the Builder Queens learned a terrible lesson at a place called Crow Mountain. It was spring, the time when winter's grip finally loosened, and communities could celebrate survival. The spring feast was a major event, bringing people together after months of confinement. At Crow Mountain, they had built a massive chamber specifically for gatherings. It was ambitious, grand, meant to make a statement about their prosperity and skill. During the feast, with the chamber packed with celebrants, the roof collapsed. 12 builders died, crushed under tons of falling rock. Among them was Sura's own daughter. Can you imagine? You create these incredible structures. You save hundreds of lives through your ingenuity, and then your own child dies in a collapse because someone, maybe even you, pushed the engineering too far. The survivors, working through their grief, did something that marks them as true engineers. They investigated. They wanted to know exactly what had gone wrong, not to assign blame, but to prevent it from ever happening again. And they discovered that the builders had tried to span too great a distance without adequate support. The chamber had been too ambitious. The ceiling had been too wide for the supports they'd used. From this tragedy came the sacred measures. These were rules that could never be broken, encoded with the same care as the digging songs. The distance between supports could never exceed 3 tall women lying head to foot. That's roughly 18 feet in modern measurements, though of course they didn't think of it that way. They thought of it as bodies, as human scale, something you could visualize and check by eye. Mammoth tusks became standard support beams. So did thick leg bones from the largest animals. The builders had noticed that these natural materials, with their gentle curves, actually distributed weight better than straight wooden poles. The curve meant the force travelled along the beam rather than concentrating at joints. Again, this wasn't superstition. This was applied physics learned through observation and experimentation. They developed a test for structural integrity that's frankly brilliant. They would place drops of water on stone surfaces and watch how they spread. If there were micro cracks, invisible to the eye, the water would be drawn into them, creating a telltale pattern. This early warning system saved countless lives by identifying weaknesses before they became catastrophic. Now, we need to talk about what daily life was actually like in these underground kingdoms, because it was profoundly different from surface existence in ways that shaped human consciousness. Without sunrise or sunset, without the natural rhythm of day and night, communities had to create artificial cycles. They used controlled fires as timepieces, maintained communal activities to give structure to days that otherwise had no markers. Women spun thread in eternal twilight, their hands learning to judge quality by touch alone. Children grew up learning to navigate in total darkness, developing echolocation skills that modern humans have almost entirely lost. They could click their tongues and hear the echoes, building mental maps of spaces they couldn't see. The darkness did something else, something that might seem minor until you really think about it. It democratized beauty, physical appearance, facial features, the things that drive so much of human social interaction. They mattered far less when you spent most of your time in dim firelight or complete darkness. What mattered was voice, touch, smell. How someone laughed. The gentleness or roughness of their hands. The way they smelled after working, after bathing, after making love. Marriages were arranged not by looking at someone and deciding they were attractive, but by compatibility of sound. Could you stand listening to this person's voice every day? Did their laughter make you want to laugh too? This might sound strange to us, but it created incredibly stable partnerships. Couples were matched on personality, temperament, compatibility, all the things that actually matter for long-term relationships. This sensory shift also created the first pure storytelling traditions. On the surface, in daylight, storytellers could use gestures, facial expressions, even physical demonstrations. Underground, in the dark, there was nothing but voice. A skilled narrator could hold hundreds of people spellbound for hours, with nothing but words and the occasional shadow play cast on smoke by firelight. The best storytellers were treasured, their craft as vital as the builders for maintaining community cohesion through the endless dark months. The spiritual transformation that happened underground was equally profound. Menstruating women were given special chambers where their blood could return directly to the earth. These red chambers were sacred spaces that men could not enter, and before you assume this was about considering menstruation unclean, understand what these chambers actually became. They were centers of power, women's power, specifically. In the red chambers, construction plans were debated, medicinal knowledge was shared, plants and their properties discussed and tested. Political alliances were forged between clans. Young women were educated about their bodies, about childbirth, about the accumulated wisdom of generations. These were not places of exile. They were the private clubs where the real decisions got made. Elderly women gained an entirely new status in this underground world. Women who could no longer dig, who no longer bled, became memory keepers. Their minds were living libraries, holding accumulated knowledge about rock types, water tables, seasonal changes, dangerous signs, successful techniques. When decisions needed to be made about where to dig next or whether a chamber was safe, these grandmothers were consulted with the same deference a modern engineer might show to structural calculations. And when a great builder died, her legacy was literally built into the walls. Her hand would be painted with red ochre, that same iron-rich pigment used to bless the tools, and pressed into the deepest wall of her finest creation. The handprint would last for millennia, making her part of the shelter forever. It was both memorial and claim, a statement that said, "I made this. I kept people alive. I will never be forgotten." These weren't primitive people fumbling in the dark. These were sophisticated societies with complex social structures, advanced engineering, and spiritual practices that honored both individual achievement and collective survival. They were masters of stone and sacred darkness, and they were building something that would last far longer than they could ever have imagined. The period between 35,000 and 25,000 years before Christ represents what we might call the golden age of shelter cities. This is when isolated communities began connecting, when local innovations spread across continents, and when underground living became so sophisticated that some clans preferred it even when they didn't strictly need it for survival. The Thunder Ridge Confederation is the most impressive example we know of. 5 major excavation sites, each one a city in its own right, connected through underground tunnels that stretched for miles. And I do mean miles. Traders could walk for days through these passages without ever seeing sky. They navigated by carved symbols that indicated direction, distance, and danger. A circle with 3 lines meant water ahead. A hand with fingers spread meant 500 paces to the next intersection. A crossed-out human figure meant this passage was unstable, use at your own risk. Think about the logistics of creating this network. Each tunnel had to maintain proper ventilation. Support structures had to be consistent enough that travelers could move safely even in complete darkness. Emergency supplies had to be positioned at regular intervals. This wasn't just construction. This was infrastructure planning on a scale that required centralized coordination and shared standards across multiple communities. The crown jewel of the Confederation was the Grand Gallery. This started as a natural cave, but what the builders did with it was extraordinary. They expanded it into a meeting hall where 500 people could gather comfortably. The acoustic engineering alone would impress modern architects. A speaker standing at the center could be heard clearly in every corner without shouting. The ceiling height, the wall angles, the floor composition, everything worked together to carry sound perfectly. They had created an auditorium that would have made the ancient Greeks jealous, and they did it thousands of years before Greece existed. Here, in the Grand Gallery, the Council of Grandmothers met every winter. This was where power really resided in the Confederation. These elderly women allocated shelter space, resolved disputes between clans, arranged marriages that would strengthen alliances. Their word was law, and it was law precisely because everyone understood that their decisions were based on lifetimes of accumulated wisdom. But let's not romanticize this too much, because where there's power, there's also exploitation. And shelter control created the first real economic inequality in human history. Matriarch Yana controlled the warmest, driest chambers in the largest complex. She used this leverage ruthlessly. Families paid tribute to her in furs, preserved meat, and most importantly, labor. You wanted a safe, comfortable place for your children? You owed Yana work days. You maintained ventilation shafts. You hauled water from underground springs. You spent weeks expanding new sections, all so that Yana's clan could grow even more powerful. If you couldn't pay, if you didn't have the resources or the labor to trade, you got relegated to the damp outer chambers. These were the marginal spaces, the areas closest to the surface where temperature swings were more extreme and moisture seeped through the walls. Chest infections killed children in these chambers every winter, not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly enough that parents had to watch their kids struggle for breath, knowing that just a few chambers deeper, in the spaces they couldn't afford, the air was dry and warm. This created the first inherited wealth that we know of. Prime shelter locations passed from mother to daughter for 20 generations. Some families were born into comfort and security. Others were born into damp walls and dead children. And no amount of hard work could change that because the system was designed to keep them in place. Eventually, though, the workers themselves figured out where the real power lay. The builders, the diggers, the people who actually created the shelters, they organized. It started quietly, with conversations in the deep chambers where supervisors rarely ventured. Then it became a coordinated action. They simply refused to expand new chambers unless they were guaranteed permanent residency rights. This was the first labor strike in human history. And it worked. Because here's the thing about underground empires. They require constant expansion. Chambers need maintenance. New spaces need to be created for growing populations. Without the builders, the whole system would stagnate and eventually collapse. Yana and the other matriarchs had to negotiate. The principle that emerged from this conflict was simple but revolutionary. Those who create shelters deserve to inhabit them. The political landscape got even more complex with what we might call the first dynastic marriage. Yana's granddaughter married the heir of the Crystal, Cave clan. This wasn't a love match. This was a calculated merger that created an underground empire controlling winter survival for 10,000 people. 10,000, that's the population of a decent-sized town, all dependent on a network of shelters controlled by two allied families. The combined empire standardized construction techniques across all their holdings. They created modular chambers, identical in dimensions and layout, that could be rapidly replicated. Each room measured 12 paces by 8 paces. Ceiling height was standardized at one tall woman with raised arms. This wasn't arbitrary. These dimensions had been tested over generations and found to be optimal for stability, comfort, and efficient construction. Standardization allowed specialized teams to move between sites, spreading innovations quickly. A team that got really good at fire pit construction could travel the network, installing upgraded heating systems. Ventilation specialists could troubleshoot problem areas. It was the beginning of professional specialization beyond just builder and non-builder. They developed underground highways, widened passages that allowed two-way foot traffic and sledge transport of supplies. Emergency caches were placed every 500 paces, containing dried food, seal oil for lamps, and spare digging tools. If you got lost or trapped, if a passage collapsed behind you, you could survive long enough to find another route or be rescued. The empire seemed invincible. And then the Earth itself ended it. We don't know exactly when the earthquake hit, but geological evidence suggests it was catastrophic. The survivors called it the day the mountains danced, which gives you some sense of the scale. 70% of the eastern network collapsed in minutes. Not gradually, not with warning, just sudden, total destruction. 800 people died instantly. Their bodies were never recovered, still entombed under tons of fallen rock. Entire family lines were erased. Decades of construction work were reduced to rubble. The survivors spoke of a rumbling that had grown louder for 3 days before the collapse. In hindsight, they realized the Earth had been warning them, but no one had understood the signs. This disaster became part of every builder's education going forward. The 3-day rumble was added to the list of absolute danger signs. If you heard that deep, growing sound, you evacuated immediately, no matter what. You abandoned your possessions, your carefully constructed homes, everything, because the Earth was about to reshape itself, and nothing human-made could withstand that force. The Confederation scattered. Some refugees headed west, others moved south, following the herds and hoping to find stable ground. But they carried their knowledge with them. The construction techniques, the sacred measures, the organizational systems, all of it spread across continents. Archaeological sites from Britain to Japan show evidence of the same building principles, the same dimensions, the same support structures. The empire fell, but its wisdom survived. Political power, we learned, is always temporary. The Earth itself is temporary, at least in the configurations we depend on. But knowledge, encoded in songs and stories and the patient teaching of grandmothers to granddaughters, that can last forever. The Thunder Ridge Confederation ended 30,000 years ago, but its legacy is literally built into the foundations of human civilization. As the world warmed between 25,000 and 10,000 years before Christ, something interesting happened. The great shelter cities, these underground marvels that had sustained humanity through the worst the Ice Age could throw at them, slowly began to empty. Younger generations, born into milder winters, started questioning whether all this elaborate underground preparation was really necessary. And you know what? That's completely understandable. If you've never experienced a winter that could kill you in hours, if you've never watched half your community freeze to death, why would you want to spend your life underground? The surface world was becoming livable again. There were forests, meadows, animals to hunt in abundance. The endless dark chambers must have seemed oppressive to people who had options. But the wise grandmothers insisted on maintaining emergency shelters. They kept the knowledge alive. They made sure that at least some of the old complexes remained functional, that the techniques were still taught, that young people still learned the digging songs even if they rolled their eyes while learning them. These elderly women understood something that the young couldn't. Climate isn't stable. What warms can cool again. And they were proven absolutely right. The Younger Dryas event brought killing cold back for 1,300 years. This wasn't quite as severe as the original Ice Age, but it was close enough. And suddenly, those maintained emergency shelters became the difference between survival and extinction. Communities that had preserved the old knowledge survived. They knew how to quickly expand chambers, how to store food properly, how to manage ventilation. Surface dwellers who had abandoned the old ways perished in numbers that must have been staggering. This validation of ancient wisdom ensured that shelter techniques remained embedded in cultural memory, even as daily need decreased. You didn't have to live underground anymore, but you remembered how, just in case. This became part of the human survival toolkit, as fundamental as knowing how to make fire or track game. The transition to agriculture, which happened in fits and starts across different regions over thousands of years, transformed underground construction without eliminating it. Those shelter chambers, with their stable temperatures and protection from light, turned out to be perfect for grain storage. A harvest that would rot or be eaten by pests on the surface could last for years underground. This meant communities could survive bad harvests, could accumulate surplus, could trade with neighbors. The same spaces that had saved lives during the Ice Age now enabled the food security that agriculture required. Sacred ceremonies moved underground as well. There was something about those deep spaces that felt spiritually significant. The connection to ancestors who had sheltered there, the womb-like enclosure, the absolute darkness that forced internal contemplation. Early agricultural societies often centered their goddess religions on caves and constructed underground temples that deliberately echoed the ancient shelter designs. They weren't just copying, they were honoring. They understood that something profound had happened in those spaces, that their ancestors had overcome impossible odds through ingenuity and determination. Young women still underwent initiation, rituals involving 3 days alone in absolute darkness. This practice continued for thousands of years after anyone actually needed to live underground. The initiates would emerge as adults who had conquered humanity's oldest fear, who had proven they could sit with their own thoughts in the void and not go mad. It was a test of psychological strength that our modern world has largely abandoned, though maybe we're poorer for it. Different cultures adapted the core techniques to new purposes, and this is where things get really fascinating. Mediterranean peoples discovered that volcanic rock, soft and easy to carve when first exposed, could be shaped into entire underground cities. Cappadocia in modern Turkey is the most famous example, with complexes that could hide thousands of people from invading armies. The principles were identical to what Sura and her contemporaries had developed 30,000 years earlier. Proper spacing of supports, careful ventilation management, chambers designed to human scale. Northern Europeans developed root cellars that followed the ancient sacred measures, even when the builders had no idea why those proportions worked. The dimensions had been encoded in folk tradition so deeply that they persisted long after the original reasoning was forgotten. Angled entrances to trap warm air, ventilation shafts that could be sealed in storms, support spacing that matched 3 women lying head to foot. The DNA of Ice Age engineering survived in every farmstead from Norway to Scotland. Chinese builders discovered that shelter construction techniques worked perfectly for mining operations. The same support systems, the same ventilation principles, the same careful attention to structural stability applied whether you were digging for safety or digging for jade and copper. Every mining tradition in the world traces back, if you follow it far enough, to those first desperate women scraping at frozen earth. And here's something that should make you think. Every basement dug today, every subway tunnel carved, every bunker constructed carries that same DNA. The fundamentals haven't changed because they can't change. Physics is physics. Stone behaves the way it behaves. The relationship between span and support, between ventilation and habitability, between human scale and structural stability, all of that was worked out 30,000 years ago through trial and error that cost lives. We're still using their answers. Modern archaeologists with ground-penetrating radar continue discovering shelter complexes of staggering sophistication. Recent finds in Russia reveal multi-story excavations with indoor wells, dedicated workshops, and ceremonial chambers decorated with thousands of handprints. The complexity is humbling. We've found ventilation systems that use thermal dynamics so elegantly that mechanical engineers study them for insights. We've found structural solutions that require no external power, yet maintained livability indefinitely. Chemical analysis of preserved hair shows something else remarkable. Shelter dwellers were better nourished than surface groups during the same period. The stable environment allowed better food preservation. The reduced exposure to extreme cold meant lower caloric needs. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving in a way that their surface-dwelling contemporaries couldn't match. Contemporary preppers, people worried about societal collapse or natural disasters, are quietly studying these sites. And you know what they're discovering? That ancient solutions often surpass modern techniques. Our technology-dependent approaches require power, require supply chains, require systems that can fail. The passive ventilation, the thermal mass heating, the structural engineering of Ice Age shelters require nothing but knowledge and labor. They work forever, or at least as long as the Earth itself remains stable. As climate change threatens new disruptions, governments worldwide are studying prehistoric shelter technology. This isn't public knowledge, mostly because admitting we might need Ice Age survival techniques isn't great for public morale, but the research is happening. Engineers are analyzing those ancient sites, trying to understand exactly how they achieved such remarkable results with such limited tools. There's something deeply moving about walking through these ancient sites. Handprints of children, perfectly preserved after 40,000 years, pressed into shelter walls across 3 continents. Each print is a story. A young person, probably a girl, learning the builder's craft from her mother and grandmother, making her mark, literally, on the work that would keep her family alive. Those handprints remind us that human ingenuity, driven by parental love, can overcome any challenge nature presents. The women who first scraped at frozen earth weren't thinking about legacy or history. They were thinking about keeping their reslow, children alive through the night. But in doing so, they created techniques and knowledge that would sustain humanity for 40,000 years and counting. We are all children of the shelter builders. Every one of us exists because some ancestor, somewhere in the frozen reaches of the Ice Age, figured out how to dig into the earth and stay warm. They didn't give up. They didn't accept that winter had become death. They fought back with intelligence and determination and the fierce protective love that has always been humanity's greatest strength. And that knowledge, carved in stone and preserved in memory, remains available to us today. If we need it again, if the world turns cold or hostile or impossible, we know how to survive, because the grandmothers made sure we would remember. Because the builders left their handprints in the deep places, messages saying, "We were here, we did this, we did not surrender." That's the legacy carved in stone and memory. That's what 45,000 years of human ingenuity looks like. And it's still here, waiting in the dark, just in case we need it again.